The following podcast contains graphic language and descriptions of violence that may be disturbing to some listeners. They say war is hell. That may be a cliche, but it's not an exaggeration. That became clear to me in the conversations I had with Tommy Vargas, Eddie Randall, and the other veterans who you're about to hear. First, I want to repeat the warning I just gave you. This episode contains graphic and heartbreaking descriptions of violence. Second, the military trains its soldiers to recount the details of battle in a clinical and detached fashion. But don't confuse these stark descriptions with indifference. All the veterans I spoke with for this podcast struggled daily with the fact that they had to take lives, even when it was someone who was trying to kill them. It's not a job that they relish. And when they discover that innocent lives were lost in a skirmish, the nightmares increase exponentially. Tommy and Eddie and everybody I spoke with views each life lost as a human soul equal to theirs, regardless of religion or nationality. In fact, they risk their lives to protect the lives and liberty of Iraqis, to give them a real chance to pursue happiness. While Tommy and Eddie and the other veterans struggle with horrific memories of war, we all sleep more peacefully because their sacrifice saved us from being put in the same no-win situation. So remember the words of Atticus Finch. Don't judge a man until you've walked a mile in his shoes.
Think again.
Horrific way to tell this story.
You're whitewashing the truth.
War criminals are cool now, I guess.
You're whitewashing a horrific
Lies
crime.
and more lies.
Don't listen. Supporting war criminals?
How is this binge-worthy?
Complete and utter garbage.
My co-writer Michael Flaherty and I got some feedback for this podcast. As expected, from my side of the aisle, with my fellow liberals accusing me of trying to whitewash a massacre. So this is an appropriate time to talk about massacres. Is it a massacre when civilians are caught in the crossfire of a gun battle? Because again, that's what Nisour Square was. It's not me concluding that, it's the government saying that the Raven 2-3 convoy was shot at, multiple times, by enemy insurgents, before any of the private military contractors fired their weapons. My name is Gina Keating. I'm an investigative journalist. And this is Raven 2-3, Presumption of Guilt. Here's what the DOJ lawyer, Demetra Lambros, told the appellate court in Washington, D.C. on January 17, 2017. She's describing the trial testimony of Raven 2-3 team leader Jimmy Watson, who you'll hear from in this episode. Lambros tells the court, quote, what he thought he heard was enemy fire. He's very clear about it. Those first shots did not come from the convoy, he said. What he heard first sounded like Iraqi AK-47 fire in the distance. Now, he reiterates up until that point, no one from Raven 2-3 had fired. He repeats it again. Nobody's firing when he hears those shots. So there you have it. 2 years after it convicted Dustin Hurd, Evan Liberty, Nick Slatton, and Paul Slough for committing an unprovoked massacre against unarmed civilians, the government formally and publicly repudiated its own theory in open court. So we're going to go with the government's theory for our recreation of these crucial events, Mike. And my fellow libs, I get it. 3 years ago, when someone asked me to look into this case, I said no way. And then I actually read the trial transcript, and I thought to myself, selfishly, if this could happen to these guys, it could happen to me.
Gina, I felt the same way. It's like that line Joseph Heller wrote in Catch-22. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. When you first told me about this, I thought that you were trafficking conspiracy theories. It went against everything I had read about Blackwater and Nisour Square. After looking at the testimony and reading eyewitness accounts and actually getting into the events of that day, however, I couldn't believe that I was so easily duped, not just by the government and the alternate history they created, but also by the willing press, who was all too eager to support them and report on the trial without challenging any of the assumptions or going back and even reading what they had written about the days of that event themselves. To paraphrase Orwell, the Department of Justice erased the truth about Dustin Hurd, Evan Liberty, Paul Slough, and Nick Slatton. The erasure was forgotten, and the lie about these men and the events of Nisour Square became the truth. That's why in today's episode, we're going to talk about facts, not feelings. We're recreating the events of Nisour Square with evidence from the government's own investigation. In this recreation, actors will read sworn testimony from 3 different Raven 2-3 trials. Remember, that's how many tries it took the Department of Justice. I guess convicting innocent men at least still requires some time and dedication before the lie completely gets cemented as truth. You're also going to hear interviews that we conducted with several people who were there that day. We wanted some primary sources to verify facts and provide new testimony that the court didn't want to allow or didn't want the juries to hear. Some of these individuals were not called to appear at the trials. Why was that? Because their testimony contradicted the government's theory of the case. You will see that the government was able to spin this fanciful story not only through lies of commission, but also through omission of the truth as well. This part is critical. We're going to draw on this hidden evidence the prosecutors did not hand over to the defense because of, in their words, a series of innocent oversights. Finally, in this recreation, we're going to avoid testimony of questionable provenance. So, for example, the testimony of a person with provable ties to Iranian-backed anti-American militias, such as the Mahdi Army or the Badr Corps, they're not going to be included, for obvious reasons. Today, we want you, our podcast audience, to be the first American jury of sorts to hear what really happened in Nisour Square from all available sources, not just the ones curated by the prosecution and the judge. All right, let's get to it, Gina.
September 16, 2007 was a Sunday, a workday for Iraqis who opened their businesses, banks, and government offices from Saturday through Thursday. It was hot and sunny, and a few minutes before noon, a massive explosion went off about 2 miles from the green zone. The explosion shook the ground and sent up a plume of smoke that you could see for miles. The car bomb went off right outside a complex of offices called the Izdihar compound. A Blackwater team, call sign Raven 4, had escorted an American diplomat to the Izdihar compound earlier that morning. The diplomat, named Rodena Fatah, worked for USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. That was the agency tasked with rebuilding Iraq's shattered public services. She was meeting with her counterparts in the Iraqi government that day to award scholarships. Raven 2-2 and Raven 2-3 were on standby in the green zone in case anything complicated happened to Raven 4 or Rodena Fatah. Most of the Blackwater men remember being at the gym or in the chow hall when they heard and felt the massive explosion. Dustin Hurd recalls what happened next.
I think we were off, but we were told to stay close in case we were needed. Days like this were normal, when you were supposed to be off, but, shit happens, and you gotta be ready to roll in a second's notice. In the military, you don't say 23. Our team was Raven 23. But you don't say 23, you say 2-3. That way it comes across the radio correctly. I remember the call on the radio, 2323 to the trucks. Once we got the call, I knew time was in short supply, and it was time to go to work.
Dustin, like his teammates, put on his fire-retardant flight suit and body armor and met the rest of the team at the Patriot parking lot. We mentioned before that that's where Blackwater's intelligence analyst, Mia Lasik-Johnson, briefed the teams and reviewed the safest routes through Baghdad. That day, one of the preferred routes from Izdihar compound back to the green zone went through Nisour Square. Earlier, Mia told the Raven teams to be on the lookout for a white Kia sedan, a possible car bomb. Intelligence reports did not specify its target or where in Baghdad it was located. She also reminded them that the insurgency had put a bounty on their heads, $1,000 for 10 dead Blackwater guys. Raven 2-2 took off to help bring Rodina Fatah to safety. Raven 2-3 sat at checkpoint 12. That's the main access point between the red and green zones, and waited. This is Dustin Hurd again, talking about what that wait was like.
Sitting there waiting to leave from the checkpoint is one of the hardest things that you could ever do. It's not the fear of battle that it is, but it's the waiting, knowing that people are in trouble, and it just eats you that you're sitting there. It's like a dog on the leash when they want to go, but you're just sitting there waiting and holding them. You let go of the leash and they go.
There were 19 men assigned to Blackwater's Raven 2-3 team. All of them were Americans, all U.S. veterans who had served in active conflicts all over the world. They were expert marksmen, gunners, drivers, medics, and commanders. One member of Raven 2-3, named Jeremy Ridgway, was missing that afternoon, running late. Typical, Dustin Hurd thought. Ridgway had joined Blackwater in 2007 when both Eric Prince and the U.S. military were having trouble finding recruits. He had been in country about 9 months and had earned a reputation as a talented marksman, but also an oddball. He was disorganized, told inappropriate jokes and improbable tales about his battlefield prowess, and he was frequently late to missions. Ridgway came to Blackwater after 15 years of drifting in and out of jobs. He worked at a pizzeria, a deli, and at a barnyard as a ranch hand. He worked in construction. He'd been kicked out of the Army a few months after enlisting at age 18 for missing formations, being disrespectful to his NCO, and leaving his post without permission while on restriction. Ridgway would later say in his trial testimony that he considered Dustin Hurd, Evan Liberty, Paul Slough, and Nick Slatton to be his friends. Dustin told the team leader, James Watson, to leave without Ridgway. But then the 36-year-old Ridgway showed up and climbed into the turret in front of Dustin's. Watson gave the order to head to Nisour Square.
At about the same time that Dustin and his Raven 2-3 teammates were strapping on their body armor, a medical student named Ahmed Al-Rubieh and his mother, Mahassan Al-Khazali, a physician, were driving across Baghdad to pick up Ahmad's father, a pathologist. Just before noon, Ahmad and his mother headed towards the square in their white Kia sedan. Ahmed was driving. By all accounts, before and after the incident, they were the model family. Both parents were accomplished physicians, and their bright son was following in their footsteps. He was on his way to medical school. Traffic typically poured into Nisour Square from 4 main arteries. There were no lanes, no stoplights, just Iraqi traffic cops trying to keep the cars flowing around a large, empty fountain in the center of the traffic circle. A car bomb had demolished part of the traffic circle in April. 5 months later, it was still under construction. There was a shed-type building that served as a bus shelter down a road south of the circle, and a kiosk also immediately south of the circle for Iraqi police to shelter in. At the say-so of team leader Jimmy Watson, who everybody called Haas, the Raven 2-3 convoy lumbered through checkpoint 12 and onto the road to Nisour Square. When they got there, Watson told his men over their internal radio channel to position the 4 armored trucks across the southern end of the square. These big, hulking vehicles, painted bright white, were blocking northbound traffic lanes. "Lock it down," Watson told them. It was 11 minutes after noon, according to Blackwater radio logs. He saw armed Iraqi National Police and Iraqi Army stationed around the traffic circle. There were a couple of uniformed Iraqi policemen in the kiosk, They weren't doing much to help stop traffic, Mealy noted. He scanned the rooftops of the buildings surrounding the circle. There were armed men up there, too. He waved them off. Off to his left, he saw an Iraqi soldier in what he later described as a fighting position behind a wall of sandbags. He glanced back over his shoulder and saw 4 of the 7 turret gunners, Paul Slough, Dustin Hurd, Jeremy Ridgway, and Donald Ball, waving to motorists approaching the circle from the south. They were displaying their weapons and motioning the motorists to stay back. 2 things happened almost at once. First, Jimmy Watson, in the passenger seat of the 3rd vehicle, with Paul Slough, Evan Liberty, and Nick Slatton, heard pop, pop, pop. The sound of an AK-47, the weapons carried by insurgents. Mealy, in the lead vehicle, saw bullets skipping off the pavement. Somebody was shooting at them. It just wasn't clear where it was coming from. Next, a white Kia sedan separated from the stopped traffic and drove straight at the convoy. It was 12:12 when Raven 2-3 reported incoming fire from multiple points around the traffic circle. This is what Jimmy Watson saw. Here's an actor reading his actual testimony from the first Raven 2-3 trial in 2014.
About the time that we heard pops, the lead vehicle commander for Vehicle 4 yelled out, "Contact! Contact! Contact!" as loud as he could. And it was fairly startling. And he said, "Hoss, there's Iraqi police firing at us." And I believe that I went ahead and I told the Tactical Operations Center that we were receiving fire at this time.
At 12:13, Watson called for backup from Blackwater Little Bird helicopters. He reported that some of the shooters were dressed as Iraqi police. Watson said he heard the hiss of pen flares. Those are small flares that Blackwater convoys use to warn drivers to stay away. None of the Blackwater men had fired their weapons yet. By this point, they were halfway through the protocols handed down by the State Department to stop traffic, and the white Kia was still coming. This is Eddie Randall explaining the steps that private military contractors take when engaging a suspected car bomb.
There were steps, absolutely, and they were broken out every single day. They are burned into my brain, and even to this day, I still remember what they are. The first thing that we would do is hand signals. You know, in Iraq, there was a little thing where you put your thumb between your 2 middle fingers and kind of curl it up. Kind of like the Italian thing, and you tell them to stop. If they didn't listen to that, you could throw a water bottle. If that still didn't work, you would flick a pin flare. Usually it'd hit a vehicle and it bounce right off. These 3 steps help to start differentiate between somebody who's not paying attention, that's becoming more and more of a threat, and then once you get into the next 2 steps, that becomes they have turned more into a threat than a non-threat. You know, the next step is you shoot into the grill. So if a car's coming at you, you shoot into the grill, and if they still do not stop, then you shoot into the windows. That is in a perfect world. That is your progression, your ROE that you're allowed, that we were supposed to follow. Now that's all dependent on how much time you have.
The car kept moving closer, within killing distance if it was carrying a bomb. Then Paul Slough put a bullet through the windshield. The driver, Ahmed Haitham Al-Rubia, died instantly, a bullet in his forehead. The passenger, his mother Mahassan, began wailing and cradling her son's body. "My son," she cried. One of the Iraqi traffic officers ran to the driver's door. He yanked on it, but it was jammed. But to Eddie Randall, sitting in the 4th and nearest truck, it looked like the cop was pushing the potential car bomb toward them. Here's an actor reading Randall's testimony from the 2014 trial.
The fact that it looked like he was pushing a car that was just fired upon toward the convoy, to me that looks like a threat. That's when there's quite a bit of automatic gunfire erupted from the vehicle. It was coming from the command vehicle in front of me, and I could hear it coming from the turret gunner on my vehicle.
The white Kia kept rolling toward the convoy. 4 of the 7 turret gunners, Dustin Hurd, Paul Slough, Donald Ball, and Jeremy Ridgway, lit into the vehicle with their machine guns. Ridgway later testified that he shot Mahassan and kept firing at vehicles behind the Kia. Tommy Vargas, the vehicle commander, noticed immediately that his front turret gunner, Ridgway, was firing wildly into the Kia and down the road at a couple of men standing behind the white car. Matt Murphy, in the second vehicle, testified that Ridgway was picking out targets and continued shooting down the road. Vargas called up to Ridgway in the turret. During the trials, prosecutors designated Vargas as a witness but never called him to testify. I interviewed Tommy Vargas, and this is what he would have said had he taken the witness stand.
I told him, cease fucking fire, and I elbowed him in his fucking kneecap because at the time I wasn't worried about, where his rounds are going because he's accountable for his own actions, as we all are.
Yeah.
I was just me knowing the machine gun and its capabilities. I know if you fire that gun like that, and it's already hot because it's hot out there, the possibility of you melting that barrel and making it combat ineffective was very, very high.
Sometime during these first few moments of the gun battle, sniper Nick Slatton spotted 2 men shooting at the convoy from the tree line through his scope. He took 2 shots out of the gun port of the command vehicle, killing one of them. Those were the only shots anyone reported Slatton taking that day.
The Kia was now fully engulfed in flames. The bodies of Ahmed and his mother were still inside. To use the military euphemism, the perceived threat had been neutralized. The reality was that 2 innocent Iraqi citizens, a mother and her adult son, were added to the tragic list of tens of thousands of Iraqis caught in the crossfire of a civil war. The fatal shots were fired by Blackwater security contractors. But the Blackwater guards wouldn't know this until later. 56-year-old Adil Jadiri had a currency exchange business in Baghdad. At lunchtime on that day, he hailed a cab to take him to the bank to make a deposit. The ride took him through Nisour Square. Here's what he told the first jury he saw that day. The testimony is being read by an actor.
The planes above us were firing. We started to kneel down and take cover in the car, but the gunfire was coming in all directions. We could see people falling down in the street. We could see people getting hit all around us. I got out of the car and I laid down on the street so people could see me and come save me.
The Blackwater convoy was still taking small arms fire. Tommy Vargas, the vehicle commander in Truck 4, was shouting into the radio, communicating with Blackwater's tactical command center. Eddie Randall was sitting beside Vargas in the truck.
He's calling out over the radio contact spots, points that he sees. He's seeing muzzle flashes. It sounds like he was calling out contacts down south in some bushes.
Vargas told Randall to reposition the truck so turret gunners Dustin Hurd and Jeremy Ridgway could get better beads on enemy shooters to the south.
I looked over, I saw, this is after we had repositioned, I saw rounds impacting the left side of the vehicle. Looked like splatter from bullet fragments hitting the side of the vehicle on the flat surface. Next, I remember scanning in front of me, looking at the command vehicle and seeing radiator fluid pouring out of the command vehicle in front of me. I informed Tommy, let him know that the command vehicle is leaking fluid.
Vargas got on the radio and told the team they had to get out. Blackwater's Tactical Operations Center ordered them to disengage and return to the green zone. But enemy fire had rendered the imposing command vehicle useless. The men of Raven 2-3 were now trapped inside an 8-ton Albatross. It was now 12:15, according to Blackwater's radio log. Watson ordered the 1st and 4th trucks repositioned so the fire team members could hook up a tow strap. "Please, don't let me get killed," Adam Frost said as he climbed out of the second truck to hook up the tow strap. It took a couple of minutes to attach the tow strap. At 12:18, Watson told Blackwater Command that he was exiting Nisour Square. In the short ceasefire, 29-year-old Janan Al-Kanani dared to sit up in the passenger seat of her brother's compact car and look back at her 3 children. Kanani and her brother, Mohammed, heard shooting as they approached Nisour Square, but this was nothing out of the ordinary. They were surprised to see armored vehicles blocking their way through the traffic circle. Then the shooting started. Here's an actress reading Kanani's testimony about what happened next in the 2014 trial.
When those people got killed and the first vehicle got burned, they pointed their gunfire toward us. We are the vehicles that are behind, and it was random shooting on us. We couldn't do very much. The children were lowering their bodies and heads down. We lowered our heads and bodies down, and we assumed that we were all going to be killed. As we seated 2 of my children upright, my brother attempted to help those that were wounded. My oldest son called on my brother Mohammed. He said, "Uncle, Ali got shot and he's dead." I said no, since I assumed that we are alive and the children are alive. But my son said no, there's no hair here on Ali. My brother Mohammed was attempting to get out of the car to help those who are wounded, so he opened the rear door of the vehicle, and Ali fell to the ground immediately.
10-year-old Ali died later that day at Yarmouk Hospital, not far from where he was shot in the head. He was the youngest victim of the violence that day. As the convoy drove out of the circle, Eddie Randall looked in his rearview mirror and saw smoke filling the street. Dustin Hurd was tossing out smoke grenades to cover their exit. 7 years later, Randall would find himself on the witness stand, explaining to a civilian jury the reasoning behind this.
What's the purpose of smoke grenades?
To cover our getaway. If we're going to take fire from back there, they can't see us. It's harder to hit.
Randall heard sounds from the other turret gunner, Ridgway.
When you hear Mr. Ridgway shooting down to the south, any idea of what the volume of his fire was?
The whole time we were there, it was a good amount.
And could you just give us an estimate of how many rounds you think Mr. Ridgway fired that day?
Very rough. I don't know, 100 plus?
In fact, that would not be the last time that someone noticed Jeremy Ridgway firing wildly that day. Here's Tommy Vargas again talking about a second disturbing incident involving Ridgway's uncontrolled firing of his M240 machine gun.
I could see rounds still impacting the ground, just missing the truck. And so I'm like, Dustin, he did a good job by not firing back because he could identify a target. And as we're leaving, our team got caught into a bunch of traffic, and we started to, I don't want to say crush, but we started to hit vehicles. And that one vehicle off to the left of the followed vehicle got pinned against a T-wall and our vehicle. And so Eddie's trying to maneuver it. And I looked and I know we're gonna get through it because the Puma vehicle is a big vehicle. It's made for that, for like urban, jungle, mountainous type environments. So as we're moving, I'm sitting here feeling bad for the guy's car. Like literally, I feel bad for the guy's car. I can see him bouncing around the vehicle because he had a sunroof. And Jeremy Ridgway starts dumping rounds into him. And I can see him trying to move around and from the driver to the passenger seat, and I start seeing him taking rounds. At first I thought maybe he's taking fire from someone else, because I didn't think Jeremy, but then I could hear the machine gun, and all this is happening in less than a second, 2 seconds, where I gotta make the decision, like, what the fuck is going on? And then I realized that Jeremy Ridgway is fucking shooting this guy. So that's when I yelled, "See, he's fucking fired, like, cease fire." And then I can look at the guy, like my glass is right here at my window. You're real snug up against it. Then I can see him take one to the jaw, pretty much took his jaw off, and then he took one to the head and like to the middle of the face, and a couple more in his chest, and then his stomach, and his legs. And then that's when I elbowed Ridgway a second time. And I yelled, like, I'm sorry for cursing, but I was like, yo, cease fucking fire. Like, what the fuck are you doing? And he didn't say nothing. And like, I was pissed. I was like, you know, I looked back at the guy and he's fucking dead. He's, you know, he's I don't want to say pieces, but his body's mangled. He got hit close range with a 240 machine gun, 7.62 millimeter. I mean, he must have got hit like about 20 times, probably more. And it was right there, that's like 2 feet from me.
Trial testimony would show that Jeremy Ridgway shot into 3 separate cars on his way out of Nisour Square. The convoy limped back to the green zone through heavy traffic. That took another 20 minutes. They reported taking small arms fire along the way. By the time they reached the Patriot parking lot, Nick Poulos, the shift leader of Blackwater's Tactical Operations Center, was there to meet them. He was furious with Watson for departing Checkpoint 12 without permission. If Watson did not unilaterally make the call that he did, the incident may have been avoided. This is another critical fact to remember when we get into the trial. Poulos immediately relieved Watson of his weapons, while the rest of the team took stock of their vehicles and each other. There were bullet strikes, a dozen or so on the door of the command vehicle, and a couple on the 4th truck, the one Vargas and his men were riding in. Only one team member had an injury, Watson later told the court.
I believe Dustin Hurd had some burns on his arms. I recall the tops of his arms being burned fairly decently.
The principal, Rodina Fata, had returned to the green zone safely, but Raven 2-2 was in a standoff in Nisour Square with the Iraqi army. The team had gone out to rescue Raven 2-3 and got held up. The U.S. Army diffused the situation as officers from nearby Forward Operating Base Prosperity arrived at the scene to take stock of the damage. The State Department soon learned of the skirmish and summoned Raven 2-3 to its offices. They wanted them to make statements an hour or two later.
Mike, it's hard to believe that this incident didn't stick out in their minds. But when I interviewed Dustin Hurd, Paul Slough, Evan Liberty, and Nick Slatton in prison, they described Nisour Square as a typical day in Baghdad. Part of the reason for that can be found in this New York Times article, written from Baghdad on the day of the attack by reporter Sabrina Tavernise. Pay special attention to the body count and who's giving it.
The Iraqi government said Monday that it had revoked the license of Blackwater USA, a private security company that provides protection for top American officials in Iraq, after shots fired from American diplomatic convoy killed 8 Iraqis.
According to the Iraqi government, 8 people were killed in this ambush. 8, not 17. If you'll recall, the convoy reported being ambushed by 8 to 10 insurgents, some dressed as Iraqi police. Again, a contemporaneous report from the Blackwater radio logs and the testimony of the men tells us this. A second New York Times story, written 2 days later by the same reporter, says this. An official at Yarmouk Hospital, where the dead and wounded were taken, said 12 dead Iraqis had been taken in from 3 different incidents. 37 more Iraqis were wounded. So let's go over that. 12 Iraqis killed and 37 wounded in 3 separate incidents, Mike, not just in Nisour Square, in 3 separate incidents that day in Baghdad. Robert Ford, the charge d'affaires to the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, recalls issuing compensation payments to just 6 families for losses in the Nisour Square incident.
I was also the one who gave the families the money, which is referred to in one of the cables. That was my job as DCM.
The Iraqi families.
Yeah, the compensation money that we offered. And that was in, must have been 2009. Early 2009. First half of 2009.
So later, when we hear from the U.S. Department of Justice that 17 were killed and 37 wounded, Where do those numbers come from? The statements from both the Iraqi government, the hospital, and our own press don't support that. Both insurgents and Americans were shooting. So who killed those 8 people the Iraqi government said died in Nisour Square? There were no autopsies, no crime scene photos taken before the bodies and cars were moved, and no ballistics analysis.
I think now would be a good time to talk about the chaos that was overtaking Iraq. What would become an almost total takeover of the Iraqi government by Iranian-based militias. Perhaps you've seen the protests now in Iraq against Iranian interference, something that's been a threat to Iraq's sovereignty long before the events of Nisour Square. But Iran was quite strategic to capitalize on the instability caused by the war in Iraq. They'd infiltrated both the Iraqi police and the Iraq military. That is why trust among Iraqis in the Iraqi police and military had sunk to historic lows. The corruption had become so widespread that it gave birth to a new industry, camouflage tailors, operating out of dozens of stores that occupied entire alleyways in Baghdad. Camouflage tailors would sell an official Iraqi police or military uniform to anybody that walked into their store, regardless of whether or not they could provide identification. For 30,000 dinars, about $25, anybody could buy one of these uniforms and impersonate an Iraqi police officer or Iraqi soldier. The uniforms had become effectively meaningless. They were no good at representing if the person wearing it supported the government or if they were an imposter trying to undermine it. So when you hear Iraqi police, think potential Iranian spy or jihadist as well. Now see whether it makes sense for Iranian-backed militias to be investigating this incident. This infiltration by Iranian jihadists was well known to people fighting in Iraq, and it was clear to people following the war at home. Here's what retired U.S. Army General Barry McCaffrey wrote after visiting Iraq earlier that year. These are McCaffrey's words. No Iraqi government official, coalition soldier, diplomat, reporter, foreign NGO, nor contractor can walk the streets of Baghdad without heavily armed protection. Now, this is somebody that was well acquainted with war zones. He fought in Vietnam as well as the first Gulf War. It's also somebody who in earlier reports, just the year before, sounded an optimistic tone about the future of Iraq. But in 2007, even this battle-tested American general did not feel safe walking the streets of Baghdad without armed protection. So who was expected to provide this heavily armed protection? Blackwater. It is precisely what Paul Slough, Evan Liberty, Nick Slatton, and Dustin Hurd did every day. And it was the reason they were in Nisour Square, to rescue an employee who worked for the State Department. There was plenty of grandstanding in Washington about Blackwater. They were demonized, they were vilified, characterized as trigger-happy. Yet when American politicians and government officials went to Iraq, they went knowing that they were being protected by Blackwater. These are the people that so many people, myself included, dismissed as mercenaries. The reality was much different. They were men who took the most dangerous job in the most dangerous city on the planet to protect people. We won't recite the list of folks, but it spanned from President George Bush and his Vice President Dick Cheney to President Barack Obama and Vice President Joe Biden. Vice President Biden's hypocritical stance on Blackwater is so outrageous, we're going to dedicate an entire episode to it next week. For now, we're going to return to the situation in Nisour Square in 2007. At the time, Iranian-backed militias like the Mahdi Army and the Badr Corps had successfully infiltrated the police and army. Again, we'll talk about the Mahdi Army and the Badr Corps in future episodes. For now, we realize it can be hard to keep the combatants and their goals straight, so I asked my friend, Entifad Kambar, if he could clear it up for me. Entifad grew up in Iraq and has championed democracy throughout his life. He's got the scars to prove it. He was unlawfully imprisoned and tortured under Saddam Hussein. He's witnessed the deaths of family and friends who joined him in the fight for a free and independent Iraq. But he's not just a warrior. He's also super smart. He has 2 different master's degrees in engineering from Georgia Tech. You see, Entefad was not only the director of the Iraqi National Congress during his exile in Washington, D.C. between 1990 and 2003, he also advised the Bush administration and the new Iraqi government about how to foster democracy in Iraq. Here is Entefad, giving Gene and I some ground truth about the situation in Iraq in 2007.
The Iraqi police in southern cities, specifically in Amara, Maysan, melted. No one fought the Mahdi army. That was in 2004, or maybe.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. They didn't even fire a single shot back.
They did not fire. They joined the Mahdi army. In fact, they took over the uniforms and they joined the Mahdi army. So, are they infiltrated? You bet they are. You bet they are. Interesting enough, something you should know. I think Article 9B or C, I can't remember, of the Iraqi Constitution, which was written by the Shia and the Kurds, says there is no militias in Iraq. And the reason they put this article, so they integrate Badr Corps with the police and the army.
Wow. So the Badr Corps is the police and army.
They integrated and they became, his service in Badr was counted as service in the Iraqi army.
Okay, and
that's the point I keep telling people.
Wait. Entefad, just so that's a clear sentence for the podcast, like people will hear Badr Corps and everything else, but service in a jihadist group dedicated to killing Iraqis, that counted as service to the Iraqi government?
Yes. Hadi al-Amiri, the head of Badr, became general in the Iraqi army.
Oh my God.
He gets the salary of a general as we speak now.
It's not just the Iraqi government who overlooked the involvement of Iranian terrorists with the Iraqi police. As we'll see later on, one Iraqi police officer with suspected ties to the Badr Corps got special treatment from the United States government. They called upon him to play a key role as their star witness against Blackwater. Before we get there, let's finish up this episode about Nisour Square and its aftermath. We will probably never know the exact number of people who died that day. There's no doubt that innocent people were killed. Fortunately, they were not viewed as a statistic or written off as collateral damage, like hundreds of thousands of other Iraqis who died in the war this century. No, at least a few of these people got the dignity of having their individual names mentioned. We got to read about their lives and their careers. We heard their stories, and we at least got to experience a tiny fraction of the grief that their fathers, mothers, brothers, and sisters who were left behind had to deal with as they tried to pick up the pieces. It's heartbreaking, and it makes you angry. Nisour Square should have been a galvanizing moment. These victims deserve justice. Their families craved it. But they got the opposite. They didn't know it, but they were about to be exploited and used. Because there was a movement afoot to cover up what really happened that day.
But within weeks of the shootings, the legend and losses of Nisour Square were growing. A narrative took shape within the U.S. government in response to Iraq's justifiable and mounting anger at the never-ending carnage. The story took on a life of its own, so much so that one evening, a U.S. Army investigator approached Tommy Vargas in the Green Zone. He pressed a thumb drive into Vargas's hand. His name was Chris Guerrero, and he seemed to pop up whenever Blackwater contractors got involved in a firefight.
But he approached me one night in 2007, and he gave me a thumb drive. He gave me a thumb drive, and he gave me instructions. He said, listen, Tommy, he was like, you're my friend. You know, I've met you out here in Iraq. He said, and he told me, you seem like a pretty solid dude. And I thought, at first I thought the guy was, whatever, joking, and he gives me this thumb drive, and he says, whatever you do, don't open it in country. Don't review the files on your computer in country. You know, when you get home, take a look at it, but I want you to hold on to it because I got a feeling, excuse my language, I can curse?
Yeah.
He says, I think they're trying to fuck your guys.
Raven 2-3 is a production of Think Again Studios. It's written by Gina Keating and Mike Flaherty. Our producers are Ashton Smith, Gina Keating, and Mike Flaherty. Executive producers are Chai Ling, Lindsay Fellows, and Valerie McGowan. Mitchell Weinbaum edited this episode, and he also serves as our associate producer, along with Kyle Hartford and Tina Graff. Lindsay Fellows and Aaron Fullen supervise the music. Our theme song is performed by Chloe Caroline. Thanks to Ann and Neil Corkery for their kindness and generosity. Finally, we owe a debt to our men and women in uniform. Thank you for defending our freedoms so that strangers may one day enjoy them as well. For more information about this podcast, go to thinkagain.me. There you can find additional research and primary resources regarding the case of Raven 2-3. You can learn about future episodes and receive updates as events continue to evolve. You can also learn more about our future projects, as well as award-winning films, music, and books created by our team. Thanks to everyone who donated so much of your time and talent to this passion project.